There's a new generation of voters to keep in mind coming up in 2020.
As many as 500,000 people are preparing to march in Washington. Many of them will be high school students.
Teenagers all over the world testifying in front of the UN. They're organizing town halls with influential politicians.
These numbers aren't anyone's opinions or political views. This is the current best available science.
This is a movement that every single person can be a part of.
Not just at high schools like this one, but also middle schools, even elementary schools. Some educators are trying to grapple with the question of how young is too young to protest.
Kids who are under the care of a teacher who has control of their grades in life are not free agents.
Kids had become a dirty word, like you're acting like children.
I have an idea. Let kids be kids for a while before they get swimming in the toxic soup of what we do.
You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal.
To every politician who is taking donations from the NRA, shame on you.
They're children. They're not old enough to have the perspective that adults do. That's why we don't let them vote or drink.
They expect our generation to have a short attention span, and we are not going to let that happen.
This is student-led. This is the power of this movement, of this moment.
The adults who've brainwashed these kids should be brought up on charges of child abuse.
We are at the helm of what is being called the biggest global civil rights movement in history.
Fight for your lives before it's someone else's job.
We're here. We're talking to you right now. This has never happened before.
These kids are really good at finding one another in ways that we haven't seen before.
They got the money behind them and they got the organization. Will this have big impact, do you think, in November?
One big question for Election Day tomorrow is, will young people show up at the polls?
Millions of Americans, known as Generation Z, will be able to vote for the first time next year.
Gen Z is the next wave.
Gen Z.
Generation Z.
Gen Z.
Generation Z.
Generation Z. Gen Z.
Generation Z.
Why does the story of Generation Z need to be told right now? Yeah, that's, there is a context for a mobilized generation. So when 9/11 was happening, my mother, she was pregnant with my twin sister and me, and my parents, they had just made the transition from living in New York City to living in the suburbs. I think my experience with 9/11 has always been purely academic and intellectual, meaning that we learned about these events in school and that they were terrible atrocities, but there's always been some sort of distance with it. When I was younger, my mom and I, we used to read People magazine together almost every week. And I remember this one time, we get this issue and there's this entire segment dedicated to kids whose parents had died in 9/11. And I opened it up and I didn't think much of it until I saw my friend Jamie featured in the article. That's what it was like to grow up Gen Z, to live in the direct periphery of 9/11.
A lot of us were born either right before it or right after it. My father told me he found out he was going to be a father on 9/11. That shook his world twice, because he said that one of his first thoughts was he hopes that his son and his friends don't end up 18 years later walking into that war.
When it comes to Generation Z, there is so much diversity in terms of how we experienced moments in our history. Depending on our contexts or our backgrounds, we felt the earth shake at different frequencies.
In a more roundabout way, the first crisis I remember was the 2008 housing crash. I'm still trying to understand a little till now about how and why the housing crash happened and what was wrong leading up until the actual crash.
The market is not functioning properly. There has been a widespread loss of confidence, and major sectors of America's financial system are at risk of shutting down.
My parents, when the crash hit, they weren't able to keep their current house and they had to move out. And because of that, I was separated from other parts of my family, and I was only in first grade at the time.
But as a young person who has, kind of come of age during the recession, these kids are literally living through, there's just not enough money to go around. So that shaped really early on what Gen Z thinks about money, regardless of income. The message was, you need to worry about it. There will never be enough of it, and you cannot be guaranteed that you'll have it. Every generation has a number of different important current events, experiences, global crises, whatever it may be, that happened during their time. And so every generation is marked by a number of period effects. The real key, though, is the timing at which these period effects happen. And so if they happen during someone's adolescence all the way through young adulthood, those kinds of experiences tend to stay with them for much of their lives. They shape their values and their behaviors, their perspectives on things. So the period effects are really, what's really critical is that while we're all going through them, it's the time in our lives in which they take place that really shapes how we react to them, and then again, how we behave in the future.
So as the 2008 financial recession was happening, I was in about the first grade, and I was just learning the difference between a nickel and a dime. I would characterize myself and other members of my generation as financially anxious, if that makes sense. I think there's this understanding that, and I understand that, anything can happen at any time, and so there's always something you have to be worrying about.
The effects from 2008 are still affecting me to this day because I'd never moved before that. I haven't moved back. I'm probably not going to move back until I'm ready to settle down and I've got money set aside to move back into my old home, which is what I would want to do.
What happens when you take a look at Generation Z is that you see event after event after event, very, very clustered in the early parts of our lives. And I think being a member of Generation Z means growing up amongst these events and growing resilient from them.
And of course, this is all couched in this kind of cultural shift, which is really the Trump presidency. Coming out of an 8-year span of Obama and progressive politics, and then young people seeing that's just how it's always been, and then shifting into more conservative politics, has been a little jarring for a generation who sort of thought we were on autopilot for things around climate change or safety net programs.
We are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it.
It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
Before Donald Trump, I did not know or care who the Senate Majority Leader was. Primaries were inconsequential, and politics, they were something that happened, but never something that happened to me and with me. And after the 2016 election, I, like many other Gen Zers, realized that the stakes of not knowing and not caring were too great.
When we did our first study, we actually did it right before the election. Actually, it was in 2014, so a couple of years before the election. We asked Gen Zers what they thought about certain social issues. And you know what? The environment really fell so far down the list, it just wasn't on the radar. And we did another study after the election when we started seeing things like social regressions and a number of things that have to do with kind of regressing on environmental progress. And all of a sudden, when we did our next study, Gen Z was absolutely positively passionate and interested about doing work around the environment. And so what was interesting about that is that the passion was probably always there, but the need to be able to do something about it wasn't called upon until the environment was at risk in their minds.
With this shift brought on by this election, I feel like the slingshot had been drawn all the way back. And we realized that we had to act and that we were ready to, and all that we were missing was this catalyst to inevitably trigger this big release.
Shooting in South Florida.
This deadly mass shooting happened in Parkland, Florida, about 20 miles northwest of Fort Lauderdale.
Yet again, a school shooting in America.
Now, there in Parkland and across the country, more tributes to the lives lost in the attack, honoring the 14 students who died and the 3 adults who gave their own lives trying to protect them. But for some, the shocking and mourning is turning into outrage. Students leading the way, calling for change.
And our ambitions are unbeatable. Let's keep the guns out of the hands of the wrong people.
Whether, again, around, gun safety, we hadn't seen this generation come out for other shootings like Sandy Hook and other things. But of course, when it happened in mass at a high school where we had Gen Zers there who are also very activist, that just triggered, that just kind of lit the fire under them to say we need to do something.
This year, we did get a gun threat. It was a student on social media who posted, I think it was his gun and his black Air Force One shoes.
There was the Stoneman Douglas shooting not that long ago when I turned on the TV just to watch the news to see what happens. It was happening when I turned on the TV, and I was very shocked, but I'm also aware that America has more school shootings than most other countries, if not every other country.
We've endured too many of these tragedies in the past few years.
So I largely consider Parkland and March for Our Lives my induction into activism. My school, like many other schools in the country, had a walkout, and it made the idea of activism seem less intimidating because it was happening in our schools with our friends.
I think in terms of what gears Gen Z toward activism, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic, for each young person it's going to be different, but for most it's going to be a mix of both. Intrinsic about that do-gooder mentality that I just want to change the world and make it a better place. Extrinsic, though, is all of those externalities that I had mentioned before of a recession, a school shooting, all of the events in the world that drive people to action. I think what Gen Z is uniquely predisposed to do compared to other generations is turning anger into action.
The way I tend to think about the Gen Z response to these different period effects is I picture this circle that represents all of America's Gen Z population. And so 9/11 happens, and it has a very direct impact on this very small center who either lost people in the attacks or know someone who lost people. And then the 2008 financial recession happens, and you see a greater portion of the circle affected by this realization that the world's institutions are not only fractured, but they're fragile. Then jump to 2016, where an even greater portion of Generation Z is feeling upset by a rightward political shift. And they unite on social media and they discover that they're not alone in their anxieties about the world. Just in time for 2018, where the issue of gun violence in schools, which affects every single member of Generation Z, is brought to the forefront of national political dialogue because of the Parkland shooting. So as each event takes on this sort of ripple effect across members of Gen Z in the pre-college years of many of their lives, you see a greater portion of my generation coming to realize a truth that all American adults understand, that the only way to have your perspective heard in democracy is to raise your voice and to speak to as many people as will listen. And at this point, it stops becoming a matter of age and it becomes a matter of experience and worldview.
Fast forward, a little bit further, and you get to the coronavirus, and you have, this. We're all experiencing it, but there's this idea right now of what does that mean for me to go, for instance, if you're in high school, to go to college?
So, my senior year just got completely canceled, which wasn't surprising, but I mean, so long with free school. I'm a little bit at a loss for words, but I thought it would be good to kind of film what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, or what I'm not feeling.
In light of COVID-19, there's been a lot of focus on what are young people doing. And I think what's interesting to see is that COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting people of color, but also young people.
And so now we move into the events of 2020, and for the first time, we see just about all of Generation Z encompassed by this last ring, which represents the junction of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement.
So every single week since March, we've been surveying young people about how they feel in the time of COVID and then matching that up against our campaign performance data. What we found is that COVID-19 has made them care a lot more about all sorts of different topics, whether it's animal welfare, racial equality, or immigration. They're seeing the intersectionality of how COVID-19 is affecting the causes that they care about.
And because of this unique context, people now cared who their elected officials were and what they were doing. Uncertainty uprooted everyone's lives, so apathy was extinct.
In terms of whether or not there would be burnout amidst Gen Z, just with all of the work that they've taken on around organizing and activism, it's difficult to know. A lot of what is happening right now is because Gen Z is tired. They're stressed out because of the news. They're tired of hearing about the next big thing that's going to happen in politics, and they just want to make an impact so that they can live their normal lives.
I don't think we prioritize having the right types of conversation. From what I've seen, there is not a lot of conversation between people and the adults.
This is our future. This is what we're going to have to go through when it comes to things like climate change, when it comes to things like racial justice.
It's not enough to listen to young people. You have to hear them and you have to talk with them. I think what oftentimes happens is you'll give young people a seat at the table and you'll make them feel heard. But if you're not actively talking with them, engaging in conversation, and if you're not challenging ideas and having open dialogues, then you're not actually valuing youth voices.
I'm hoping that your generation is the resilient one, is the one that's sitting on the steps in the front of their yard with their grandkids saying, you know, I've lived through all of these things and I still managed to show up to my commitments. I still managed to follow my passions and my dreams. I still managed to give back to my community, love my neighbor, and do all those things. And you just can't let this drag you down and be this black cloud over you.
My generation hasn't known a day where our country hasn't been at war. We learned from a very young age that the only way to protect our lives was to march for them, and that the only people who can authentically speak for us are us. So we raise our voices loudly to penetrate covered ears. I'm not saying that young people are the solution to all of society's problems. We are stubborn and arrogant and beyond impatient. We are still learning to compromise, and we could be better listeners, and we'd much rather build from the ashes than mend what's broken, but we're willing to put aside the fear of what if and start asking what's next. So why does the story of Generation Z need to be told right now? Because it's still being written.